All right, welcome everybody to part 2 in the CMS Emergency Preparedness Rule webinar series. Today's webinar will be training and testing your staff. Once again, we have Jason Belden, the DPP manager, and Courtney Kesterson, the DPP coordinator.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. For the first session of the first part of the webinar, Courtney Kesterson is going to take you through some of the stuff.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So thanks for joining us for part 2. We're going to be covering the training and testing requirements of the CMS Emergency Preparedness Rule today. So if we take a look at kind of just a brief overview of our last webinar, why we're here today. This is a short explanation of why CMS is even passing this rule. So because of events like Hurricane Katrina, the Oroville Dam failure, and events like Superstorm Sandy, it shows that we have a lot of work to do to get prepared for disasters in the future. So they are looking for a more comprehensive plan from SNFs, and these requirements are what they expect you to do. So beginning November 15th, you'll need to have an emergency preparedness program that has a comprehensive all hazards approach, and you'll need to show how you're going to be working with other response partners and healthcare facilities as well. So we showed you this tree in the last webinar, and we talked about emergency operations plans, we talked about risk assessments, and today we're going to be talking about training and testing. Again, this shows how you want to build your emergency preparedness program. We talked about the bottom 2 levels before, and you can see how as you go through this webinar, we'll keep building on that, but we're skipping ahead to the exercise portion because, as you'll find out, there's a lot of effort and planning and time that goes into properly training and testing your staff, so we wanted to try and get that information to you as early as possible in the series. So we'll begin today by talking about full-scale exercises and then tabletop exercises. And Jason is going to go more into detail about how you actually need to begin training your staff.
Once again, thanks, Courtney. Once again, good morning, folks. I just want to take a minute out. Most of us have been paying attention to the efforts and the events that are going on in Houston. We all look at things like this every time it shows up on the news as like a once-in-a-lifetime event. The problem is once-in-a-lifetime events happen all over the country all the time. And so whether it was the spillway failure or potential spillway failure of Oroville this year or Hurricane Harvey and its effects, there's a serious need to have robust emergency preparedness plans. And I just want folks to know that while this is a set of regulations that you're going to be surveyed on, there's a definite benefit to making sure that you have the most robust emergency preparedness program, because I guarantee you that those folks that are in the Houston area are having their plans put to test. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can practice that to make your staff more responsive in the event of an emergency, so it becomes second nature rather than something they're learning for the first time as the event unfolds. So with that being said, let's talk about one of the requirements from CMS has said that you must have a training program for emergency preparedness within your facility. Within that training program, you must have each one of these elements that you see the check marks by the boxes. So initially, every staff member upon new hire needs to be trained. They didn't give us an exact amount of time that you have to get them trained by, but it does recommend that in your new hire orientation, emergency preparedness should be a part of that when you hire new staff. Along with the new staff, every existing staff member, all shifts, all staff need to be trained on your emergency operations plan initially and then annually. So you'll see that's the fourth check mark on the box. So besides just your staff, if you have other staff within the facility that are providing services under a arrangement or agreement, meaning you had maybe, let's say, respiratory therapy comes in and does stuff in your facility. For those folks, they need to be trained on your emergency operations plan. Or do you have physical therapists that come in that are not employees of the facility but contract employees? Things of that nature need to be trained on your emergency operations plan, as well as volunteers. So if you have volunteers that are in your facility, whether it be for activities or for any other reason, they need to be trained on your emergency operations plan consistent with the role that they would play during the event of an emergency or a disaster. Obviously, if they're coming to help you with activities or they're bringing canine companions into your facility for the residents, you don't want to put them to work doing medical stuff in the event of an emergency, and you can't do that, and you can't expect them to do that. But if you're going to ask them to help you with logistics, if they're going to help you, keep folks engaged in the event of an emergency, you want to train them to do that. So now all this stuff needs to be documented. The documentation of your staff needs to be placed in their personnel files. And then we'll talk in a second about what that looks like for ensuring that staff can demonstrate knowledge of the training program. So these are straight out of the interpretive guidance. These are the questions or the things that the surveyors will be looking for. So the surveyor is going to verify that you have a written training and testing program that meets the requirements. They're going to verify that the program is updated and reviewed annually. They will interview various staff. So many of you guys are familiar with this. A surveyor, especially a life safety code surveyor, may come in and ask one of your staff members, a random person, where the gas shutoff valve or something like that is, or what do you do if you discover fire? And your staff has to answer those questions. Now, the surveyors are going to be asking staff to provide information on your emergency procedure. So they'll verify that with a random sampling of staff. And then they're going to ask for copies of the emergency preparedness training and what training offerings you will be doing annually. And then obviously they're going to look at a sampling of staff personnel files to verify that you guys did the training portion. So that's the training. It's fairly straightforward, not a whole lot different than doing an in-service for other types of training that you do for your staff. You're just going to have to add a component now for emergency operations plans. The big element of this is going to be how you test your plan. Many of you guys see that term, testing the plan. This is not a multiple choice questionnaire. It's not a true-false question test. Testing is meant to, it's an activity that's meant for you to look at your plan to see how it would do in the event of an emergency. So CMS has said you must participate in what's called a full-scale exercise that is community-based, and that has to be done annually. They have given us a little bit of a break. If you're not able to participate in a full-scale exercise, if your folks are in your county are not putting on a full-scale exercise that you guys can participate in, you can. You don't have to do the full-scale exercise. You just have to do a facility-based exercise, and we'll talk about the differences of those two in a second. You'll have to do a second formal exercise, and that can be either another full-scale exercise or it can be a tabletop exercise. And I'm certain there are a number of folks that have a question as to what a full-scale exercise is in tabletop. We'll expand on that in a second. And then much of this will require extensive documentation. CMS has not given us mandates in terms of what that documentation must be, but they have given suggestions. And we'll talk about what those suggestions are, because I'm unaware of other forms of documentation that will work for all the things they need. And one of those things is the after action report, and we'll talk about that next. So types of exercises. If you were going to look at the in terms of a scale of how involved different kind of exercises are, you would start at seminars and do kind of work your way up. So if you were doing a full-scale exercise, that takes the most planning and everything like that. And a full-scale exercise, the best way to think of it is you are actually walking through the event. It means you're doing all the actions that you would normally do in the event of that kind of emergency scenario that's in the exercise. Now, if you're doing a tabletop exercise, these are where you talk through the event. So it's sitting down, it's discussing how you would react to a certain situation. And we'll kind of expand on that in a second.
So we'll begin by talking about full-scale exercises and then go more into detail. So we have some pictures of full-scale exercises here.
Right. So community-based full-scale exercise generally is multi-jurisdictional, meaning that you would have folks from the healthcare sector, meaning us, or acute care hospitals, or a number of other types of healthcare facility types working in conjunction with emergency responders. And you do this to practice what would happen in a real world event. And so you come up with a scenario that will allow you to do that. CMS has described a full-scale exercise as operation-based exercise, and it assesses a facility's functional capability by simulating a response. So, if you're going to participate in the statewide medical health exercise this year, that's going to be the portion that's going to test for skilled nursing facilities will be an active shooter kind of lockdown scenario. But there are a number of other kinds of full-scale exercises you could do, evacuation from an earthquake or something like that. But it is an operation-based exercise. It involves generally multiple folks. And then we'll talk about how you need to document that if that's not available in your area. So now, how do you participate in that full-scale exercise, or where do you find these? The easiest way is if you are in the state of California, find out who your healthcare coalition is for your county, where those meetings will be held, and get plugged in. If you haven't already been, you need to get plugged in right away. For folks in Los Angeles, they're going to have an exercise this year. It's going to be large, but you need to find out how you can meaningfully participate in that. If you're not going to do your own exercise or you haven't had an emergency event already this year, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, now, if for some reason you're in a county where they're not going to participate in the statewide medical health exercise, or the date, meaning the date it is November 16th, the date the rule goes in effect is November 15th. So if you want to make sure you meet that November 15th date, you may have to do your own exercise and participate in the statewide medical health exercise for next year.
Right. So
that's going to be up to you. We've asked licensing, and they've told us that if you have not completed this by November 15th, regardless of when the statewide medical health exercise date is set, then you will not be compliant. So you'll get a deficiency for the first year for this tag.
Yeah, we asked them if they would allow us to count the 16th because it's only one day off, and they said no.
Yeah. So that doesn't mean that won't change, or that folks in different district offices may view it differently. I don't know, but the official word from licensing has been to Make sure it's done before November 15th, not a day after. So now, in that case, if there's nothing available for you to do this by that date, you can document how you attempted to contact your healthcare coalition, why you were not able to participate in it, and then you can hold your own facility-based exercise, or you can get together with a couple of sister facilities or facilities that are close to you, and you can practice together. In Los Angeles, we've got a handful of facilities that are going to get together, and they're going to practice. And one's going to simulate evacuation. The other 4 are going to simulate emergency admits from that facility that's evacuating. So that would count as a community-based exercise under definition for CMS. Now, if you have had a real-world emergency where you have activated your emergency operations plans, you can use that real-world emergency in lieu of the full-scale exercise requirement. So you want to make sure that you document what happened in the event, complete an after-action report, and we'll talk about what that looks like. There's a handout that we sent with like a blank template for an after-action report and an improvement plan that's very basic. It's not, super over-the-top kind of HC compliant document, but you can certainly use that. The CMS has not said you have to use a specific format. This just captures all the information that CMS will expect. The actual emergency event must be of a sufficient magnitude. Obviously, that's open to interpretation, so that will be at the surveyor's discretion. I would say if you have had, obviously for folks affected by the Oroville event, if you evacuated for sure, that's sufficient magnitude. If you did emergency admits for one patient that came from that area, I would say that's probably not sufficient magnitude of a thing. But like I said, it's at a surveyor's discretion. So we're going to try to get through this as quickly as we can because we had the little technical difficulties. But now we're going to go on to tabletop exercises. So we talked about tabletop exercises being a talk through. This is a discussion-based, no-fault kind of environment where a scenario, a set of challenges with questions is presented to folks. So
you can see that you can use small groups if you have smaller staff sizes, but this is also something that can be scaled to working with multiple agencies to plan a large-scale event like you see in that photo on the right.
Yeah, and there's the disaster queen herself, Jocelyn Montgomery, facilitating a tabletop exercise during that nursing home incident command training. So CMS has defined that tabletop exercise involves key personnel discussing simulated scenarios. Tabletop exercise should involve senior staff, and it's a hypothetical scenario, but we want to make sure that it's clinically relevant. We'll talk about that in a second. And tabletop should be used to assess plans, policies, and procedures without having to use any of your resources. Now, we talk about these things. Each tabletop exercise has to have a leader or a facilitator, and they're going to be the ones that run the scenario. They'll propose a problem statement for your folks. They'll give them questions, and these questions will be designed to challenge your emergency operations plan. Facility must document any lessons learned, and then that's what the after-action report is. And then you'll need to have a follow-up plan for making improvements based on what you learned in the tabletop exercise. This is a part of your handout. This is A to Z, soup to nuts, add water, shake, whatever you want to call it. This is a complete evacuation tabletop exercise that you can use or modify. Feel free. It's in your handouts now. It's very in-depth. You can choose to use this. Can you choose to use a portion of it? You can use the scenario, however you see fit. It's there for your use, but you can use any exercise scenario. There are dozens, if not hundreds, on the internet that are available for free that are put on by other government agencies that you can access. So before Courtney starts, I just want to make a point. Many counties or healthcare coalitions will have tabletop exercises in a lead up to the statewide medical health exercise. And if you participate in those, you can do that and use that as your tabletop exercise. But all of the elements that we talked about before, you need to make sure it is testing your plan. So when you go to this tabletop exercise put on by the county, you want to make sure that you're testing your own plan, not somebody else's plan, and that you capture all of the elements in an after-action report and improvement plan based on what you learned from your own plan. It sounds somewhat complex, but it just means that just participating in a tabletop exercise is not going to meet the requirement. So I'm going to pass it over to Courtney because she's going to talk about how you can do your own tabletop exercise.
Right. So that packet that we just showed you screenshots of, that's specifically for evacuation, which we have seen is probably the biggest challenge to nursing homes in a disaster. However, if you want to test a different capability, you can use the other templates that we included that don't have content about evacuations on there. So if you have the packet in front of you, we'll kind of walk you through how to set up a tabletop exercise, but all of this is also included in there. So number one, if you are going to be the exercise leader, if you're the person planning how to take on the testing portion, you need to decide which part of your plan you need to test. And you can do this by interviewing different leaders from different departments and gauging which challenges they would have the hardest time with. You always want to prepare for the worst, so you want to try and challenge your staff as much as possible. Giving them a softball kind of tabletop exercise really doesn't help anybody. And so you're looking for ways to address your facility's unique needs. And then also you'll need to decide who will facilitate the scenario. So this would be the person up in front of the class or the conference room introducing everyone, reading the scenario, guiding the discussion. And then you'll also need an evaluator who will be to the side taking notes. And then you'll need to decide who among your staff you want to participate. So you will definitely want your department leaders because they will be your key players in an actual event, and they'll be leading other staff.
Yeah, and just so you know, the assembling your planning group and doing all these things, it's not a short period of time. So if you have not started on this now, my recommendation is start it now because you're going to be hard pressed to get it finished by November 15th. So.
Right. So after you have decided what part of your plan you need to test, say you decide that you do actually need to practice evacuating, as we can see in the news right now, Hurricane Harvey, there are a lot of people's plans that could probably undergo some of these exercises as well.
Right, and those capabilities that you develop when you evacuate are important because that could happen in a number of different types of emergencies, whether it's a single event, whether you had a fire or a power failure in your facility where your generator is damaged, you won't be able to bring it back online, things like that, or your air conditioning goes down when it's 110 degrees on Friday, things like that where you have to evacuate. There are so many different reasons, and this is one of the things we struggle with for our facilities, for our communities in dealing with these because our folks are non-ambulatory. They're all these things. If you haven't considered doing an evacuation exercise, my recommendation is making that at the top of your priority list. But that's up to you. You can do it whatever you want. But in this instance, we're going to give you kind of what an example of a goal and some objectives would be if you want to do your own exercise.
Yeah. Well, really quick, Jason made a great point about how practicing evacuation prepares you for more than one kind of disaster. That goes back to the all hazards approach that CMS is requiring you to have throughout your emergency operations program. Okay, so we have an example of the goal statement after we've did what part of our plan we want to test. And you want to keep this fairly general because you're going to then break it down further into 3 to 4 objectives that you want to focus on. And these would be more specific, and you want to make them measurable. You want to make them relatively attainable so that your staff can actually, set realistic goals for your staff. And then you want them to be time-based as well, because in the tabletop exercise, the facilitator will be giving you time limits within the scenario. You might get a news update 20 minutes into your evacuation, et cetera, et cetera.
So, for the objective, let's just take objective 1 where we say we will activate our staff callback. Well, what does that look like? And when you do your tabletop exercise, you want to say, okay, who's gonna prompt that? Who's gonna say we need to call all our staff back? Is it going to be the administrator? If the administrator is not there, who's it going to be? Where are those staff contacts located? All that communication procedures that you have need to be available to your staff, and they need to be able to understand how they can do that. How do you do staff assignments? So those are the kind of things that you want to make as objectives because they will help you in the event of a real issue.
Step 3, after you've decided what you want to test and your objectives, then you can kind of write the story that will set you up for encountering those challenges, and we call this the scenario. So as you can see on the right here, that screenshot that says Appendix K, that's straight out of your handout packet, just in a different look. But you can see it's set up like a story or a narrative, or you can do it in a timeline format. This gives you the parameters for your event, and you can also add to the story after your first round of discussion questions and give your staff a new challenge to deal with and require them to adapt to the changing events that you might see in a real emergency. And we call these injects for these extra challenges that you give your staff as the facilitator.
Yeah, and so many of you are looking at that, large evacuation tabletop handout and going, man, that sure seems like a lot to design on my own. I just want you to know there's nothing in the rule that says what that format looks like. So it doesn't have, we do ours because it's based on a format that's given to us by the federal government, and we try to follow those guidelines. But CMS has said it doesn't have to follow that. So it can be much less complex than that. But I'd rather have you have a full HC compliant exercise. And all of this documentation that you see will be what is required by the surveyor. One of the survey procedures says that they'll need to see the documentation. That documentation should include the exercise plan, and that's what this is that you see in the handout.
So step 4, once you have all of your documents together, you've written your scenario, you've got your handouts ready, the next step would be to actually plan the date and time, reserve the room, get together your situation manual, which would just be compiling the scenario and maybe a list of discussion questions that you're planning to use.
Right. And I don't know that it's not on there, but you should probably plan for food and stuff like that because people tend to respond better if you provide like food and drinks for them.
Oh,
that's
yes.
just, yeah.
It literally says in the packet, think about giving food to your tabletop exercise. Okay. Step 5, conducting the exercise. So once again, the exercise leader is usually the facilitator as well. That's the person up in front of the room, introducing things, moving things along. that would be the person challenging the staff to really discuss and think about each question that you've prepared. Once again, the evaluator is observing, taking notes, and all of those notes will be going into your after-action report. So the evaluator is extremely important because if you can't document it, CMS doesn't know that you did it.
Right. We talked about, all the documentation and stuff like that. But we haven't talked about time frame in terms of how long this normally takes. So I think you can expect that the exercise itself, not the planning, because planning could take up to months prior to that, but the actual exercise itself is really only an hour, maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. It's somewhere in that range because we're going to do the exercise, present the scenarios and injects, and have people answer questions, document all that stuff, and then we'll learn about what we do after the exercise is over. But the two things basically you're doing is conducting the exercise and having the debrief that Courtney's going to talk about afterwards. You should be able to get that done within 2 hours at the very most.
Right, but I think it says in the packet that it might take you like 8 hours just to work through what is in that packet.
Right,
so,
to plan it and write it down and all that stuff, absolutely. So.
Yeah. So step 6, after you have completed your discussion questions, any injects that you might have given, you can talk to your tabletop players about the overall effectiveness of the tabletop exercise. Typically, we ask people, give me 3 things that went well and 3 things that didn't go so well. And that usually gets people talking enough to gauge if it was an effective exercise of your plan there.
Yeah, and if you have, this is one of those functions where this is for the evaluator, because the evaluator should be documenting this stuff. What we didn't talk about is if you have a smaller group of folks or you have resource problems in terms of getting people to attend the exercise, the facilitator can also be the evaluator as well. If you have a small facility, if you're an ICF, your facilitator is probably going to be your evaluator. In a skilled nursing facility, you could probably find staff to document it while the administrator does the exercise itself. So, and then we've got a template over there on the right-hand side. Is that a part of the handout?
It is, yes. Okay. That's in the packet as well.
And so this is just a format that you can use. You can come up with your own. You can, Google evaluator kind of templates, and you can use any of those. There's no mandate to use a specific style. So.
And this would occur right after the tabletop exercise, too.
Yeah. Oh, sorry if we didn't make that clear. It was, immediately after the exercise is done.
So step 7, once again, documentation, easily one of the most important things about doing a tabletop exercise. So with the evaluation forms, the notes that your evaluator has taken, any other information or data that you want to include, you can put that into your after-action report. And
so, just so we're clear, CMS has not said you have to have an after-action report, but they have recommended it. And they have given a list of things that they want that you to be able to provide to them that happened in the exercise. And those are the 5 things that we have listed there. Now, we have an after-action report template. I highly recommend using that or finding another one and using that because it will answer all of these questions. You can create your own, but I think you're reinventing the wheel when it's already perfected. So don't try to overthink it. All right. So we talked about what the surveyors are going to be looking for. We've talked ad nauseum about the documentation and stuff like that. I want to point out the very last bullet point in terms of documentation of your analysis and response and how you updated your emergency program based on an analysis. So you've looked at the after action, you've designed an improvement plan based on the after action, and that improvement plan should be implemented by this date, and these are the people responsible for it. Those kind of things are going to be what the surveyor is looking for. That is all contained within that template that we gave you. It's an after-action report with an improvement plan. It's a checklist. It's super easy to fill out. I think, once again, this is one of those things you just use the tools that we're providing for you. So, proof of compliance is in that template.
Yep, so you can see on the larger screenshot, capability, evacuation. And once again, capabilities is just any of the things that those functions in your emergency operations plan that you'd be testing. So this could be either shelter in place, or it could be emergency communications. What are some other capabilities that they could test?
Well, definitely communications. I think it's something that a lot of us don't think of right off the top of our head, but as we'll get to in the third webinar, the communications portion requirements of this plan are pretty significant. And the folks in Houston and the surrounding areas can really, this should be proof of how difficult it is to contact emergency responders. So, these folks are trying to call 911. There's no clear communication to the emergency responders. They're having to use social media to tell them that we need to be evacuated. If they had a communication plan with an alternate method of communicating with these responders, they wouldn't be in this issues where they are now. So it should be really high on your list. And maybe you don't even know who you're supposed to call. Who do you call in the event of an evacuation? Who from your local jurisdiction is going to help you out? It's not 911. That's not the mechanism to get help to your facility. And so for each county, it's different. You're going to have to find out your own and put that in your communications plan. But we'll talk about that ad nauseum in the next webinar series for certain. But there are many other things that you can use as a capability. Obviously, how do you transmit medical records to wherever the folks are going? What is contained on a face sheet when you print it off? Is it all the information that the receiving facility will need? Are you making sure that you pre-identify facilities in areas both near and far from you that you can evacuate to? So there are a ton of things that you can add on in terms of capabilities.
Yeah. And so if you look at the column for observation there, I'd recommend comparing that with the objectives that you chose for your tabletop exercise. Did you meet your objective? And if not, I would put that in that column. And then you have your recommendations. What could you do to mitigate that issue again in the future?
Okay, so let's just recap. Like I said, licensing has not said that we can go past that November 15th date to meet this requirement. And the only way you're absolved of having to do that full-scale or facility-based exercise is if you've had a real-world emergency event of sufficient magnitude. Like we said, that's surveyor discretion there. And that you may need to document lessons learned from both tabletop full-scale exercise or real-life emergencies. And you need to keep that for a minimum of 3 years, and that's stated in the language of the interpretive guidance. So let's go to the next one. So we've kind of jumped around, and Courtney talked about this at the beginning. We started with an introduction to the rule, hazard vulnerability assessment, risk assessment, whatever you want to call it, emergency operations plans, and then we jumped to the training and testing. But the HVA or risk assessment is the basis for all of this stuff. The emergency operations plan contains all the policies and procedures which affect how you exercise or respond in the event of a disaster. And it's kind of like this cycle. Everything that you learn from these events or learn from events in other areas. Just because you didn't have an event doesn't mean you can't learn something from the folks in Oroville when they evacuated, or the folks in San Diego when they have large wildfires, or Santa Barbara for that matter. There are a number of ways to learn, but it's this complete cycle for your emergency preparedness program where you're continually improving and you're documenting that improvement on an annual basis. So I know we started a bit late. I'm going to try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So if you have questions, please feel free to type them in. We cut it off right at the time frame this year, but since we had a little technical difficulty, maybe it's okay if we go over a few minutes. So as long as you guys want to hang out and ask questions, we'll be happy to answer them. So I see a lot of people commenting that they couldn't get audio on the webinar. So let's see if we can get to something that's not audio related.
Let's see.
Here, scroll down. These are all audio related. Keep going. It's all audio. Keep going. So a lot of people had audio problems. Easily like 200 questions on audio problems. Let's see here.
We will check the first portion of the recording and make sure that the audio is on there. We put it online so that anybody that missed the first 10 minutes or so can watch on YouTube.
Yeah, and I will let folks know that these will be up on YouTube really quickly, and then within a month or so, we should have them up on the CAHF website if you need continuing education credits.
So here's a good question. Does the Great Shakeout count as a tabletop exercise? The Great Shakeout, they have guides on their website for healthcare facilities, and they have a tabletop version, and then they also have a functional exercise guide on there as well. I can include that in the follow-up email.
There are a number of different ways that you can do a tabletop exercise, and we talked about doing one with your healthcare coalition. The most important thing to realize is that CMS is going to look for the exercise plan, evaluator notes, after action report, and it all has to be relevant to your facility. It cannot be a generic tabletop that's done to test somebody else's capabilities. So, for example, in the Great Shakeout is a capability-driven exercise for the entire state. It's not designed for your facility. So if you want to do it for your facility, you certainly can use that as a basis for doing it for your facility. But you have to have all those methods of documenting your involvement and how it was relevant to your facility. So you can do that, but need to do it to make sure that it's clinically relevant for your own. So,
someone asked, do both the full-scale and tabletop exercise have to be completed by November 15th?
Yes.
Yes.
According to licensing, yes.
And you need 2 separate after-action reports.
Right, one for each one. So.
Here's another question. Do we meet the requirements by sending just one representative from our company, or does all staff have to attend this full-scale exercise?
So generally the full-scale exercise will be in your facility. So let's say you're going to participate with the statewide medical health exercise. Each county is going to have a different mechanism for how you participate in that, but that is going to be you participating at your facility.
And that is intended for all of your staff to participate. That is as if the event is actually happening.
Right, without disrupting operations. You don't want to, sacrifice clinical stuff, but you need to have a representative sample to simulate that you're performing these functions as if you were doing it in an actual event. Now, the tabletop, provided that staff member, if you're going to a tabletop putting on by somebody else, and you're one person, provided you're taking your emergency operations plan, you're answering the questions proposed in the tabletop exercise, based on how you would do it in your emergency operations plan. It's possible that the surveyor will say that that is okay, but I can't guarantee you that. Now, typically as a best practice, we would want multiple folks to go, because then you get, maybe if you're an administrator, you can answer the questions for every department, but maybe not. And it's always good to have a representative sample of the folks in your management team at any exercise like that. So I can't give you a yes or no. I can only tell you best practice would be to send multiple people. So
let's see here.
Scroll all the way down.
Is CERT, the Community Emergency Response Team, considered a community involvement level to comply with the regulation?
No. So the CERT team, thank you very much for volunteering your service to help with your community. And I think it's a great way to get involved in your community, to be visible to the folks in your community. But unfortunately, no, that does not count towards any portion of this regulation. So we have specific individuals or specific organization established to locate a point of contact in the event of an emergency. So in most counties, that would be the medical health operational area coordinator. And those are the folks that are tasked with coordinating patient movement and resource requests in the event of an emergency. I will tell you, some counties are much better at that than others. In the event of an emergency, those folks may be overwhelmed and unable to help you. But that's specifically who you want to have on your contact list. And we're going to talk about that at length under the communication requirements with emergency responders in the next thing. In Los Angeles County, if you're not already on ReadyNet, you need to get on ReadyNet. The county is one of few counties that will pay for you to be on ReadyNet, and that is their way of being able to provide bed information to help you in the event of an emergency. If you have resource requests, if you're sheltered in place and you're running out of things, those are the mechanisms that the county uses for Los Angeles to help coordinate that emergency response. We'll talk about that at the next webinar. So, but it seems like most of the statewide exercises are done with acute care hospitals in mind and not us. And I would say, so somebody had a question about they're actively involved in their healthcare coalition, but the coalition is designed mostly for acute care hospitals. And that is 100% true, and I think healthcare coalitions will get better the more we are actively involved in the coalition. So if you're not involved, get involved. If you're in Los Angeles County, it's a little bit different mechanism because the county is so large. It's broken up into multiple disaster resource centers that act as the coalition for segments of the county. And in those counties, CAHF is the skilled nursing representative in the healthcare coalition. And so we represent your interests. We ask any scenarios they do or tabletops or full-scale exercises that we be involved in, that they have a mechanism for us to participate in. And Los Angeles has done a fantastic job of getting us involved. Other counties, it's going to require us being the squeaky wheel to get them to, get some participation in the exercises from this point forward.
So we got a couple questions. One saying, I'm attending a NICS training. Will this count as my exercise? And then also another one, I'm attending an active shooter drill. Will this satisfy my exercise requirement?
So the drill, no. That's a little bit different than a full-scale exercise and a little more involved than a tabletop exercise. If you have identified in your risk assessment that active shooter is a risk, and you test your own emergency operations plan, you provide your own after-action report, not one done for you, based on the exercise itself, then you could make that potentially work for you. But I would say, as a practice, probably it's probably not the best thing that you want to do. You want to do something for yourself. And then I see one more question. Sorry, that is ReadyNet free for ICEFs, and we've discussed this with the county. At the moment, it's only skilled nursing facilities and acute care hospitals. So if you're in an ICF in Los Angeles County and you have questions about the communication portion of that and how you relay bed polling information and ask for resources in the event of a disaster, contact me separately, because if we have enough folks that are interested in that, maybe the county can add that to their scope of work for the next year. So.
Let's see. I am a member of our coalition in my area.
Oh, that's the one I answered earlier.
Oh, you did? Oh.
Yeah, and it was, so they were told it would be better to do on your own, and I would say that's probably best because of the documentation requirements that CMS is asking you to do. It doesn't mean that you can't join somebody else's exercise. It just means that the stuff that you're doing in that exercise has to be applied to your facility. And
right.
If we haven't said that enough, hopefully everybody gets the point of that.
So if you're going to someone else's tabletop exercise, you still need to know what capability of your own plan you're testing. You should come up with your own goal statement, your own objectives to get out of someone else's scenario. And then you still need to come up with an after-action report for your own facility when you get back home.
Right.
So participating in someone else's tabletop exercise and taking a copy home of their after-action report won't satisfy this regulation.
Right. And, there's no accounting for how astute a surveyor is going to be when they look at those things. But I would say, based on what the interpretive guidance says and based on the language in the tags, that's not going to be considered appropriate. There's been many questions about where this will be located on YouTube. If you search CAHF video, CAHF video on YouTube, I think you'll pull up all of the CAHF YouTube videos, including the first series of the webinars. Is that all the questions, or did we get to that one? This webinar is for intermediate care facilities. Somebody asked, is this just for SNFs and acutes? No, this is, so the intermediate care facilities have virtually identical regulations to skilled nursing facilities. The acute care is a little bit different. We're going to talk about the policies and procedures and how that differs between SNF and ICF on the next one. But all of the stuff that we've talked about up to this point, the risk assessment, emergency operations plans, training your staff, testing your emergency plan, every single bit of that applies equally for intermediate care facilities as it does for skilled nursing facilities. So it's important to note that from this up to this point, every single thing is identical for both provider types. So somebody asked, if we've identified in our HPA that elopement is one of our issues, can an actual occurrence of that count as a full-scale exercise? Yes, if you have activated your emergency operations plans and all the things that you will need to do in the event of elopement, that absolutely counts as an emergency event. So it doesn't have to be a disaster or some large-scale event. It could be something that happened at your facility alone. So, are there any trainings for regional centers in this, and what would be their role? So the regional centers will have a role because in the communication requirement that we'll talk about in the next webinar will be you'll need to have those folks as a part of your communication plan. We'll mention that in the next one. So,
let's see.
So somebody asked, how about when the water gets shut off? Scroll back. Shut off due to a city project. If we decide to do an evacuation exercise, the actual residents be a part of the evacuation process? I would say no, especially if you're a skilled nursing facility. Maybe if you had an ICF with ambulatory or high functioning clients, I would say yeah, you can do an actual evacuation. But if you're in a skilled nursing facility, I would simulate the evacuation, not actually physically take residents out of the building.
Or use a balloon to represent a patient.
Right. Tie it onto
a
wheelchair, and that will simulate that you have somebody in the wheelchair. Or if you have volunteers, or you have, nursing students, or anybody that you can draft in, you could use them as fake victims. But my recommendation is not to displace those folks, even in an exercise. So.
Right.
Do you have any more?
Yes. So this exercise is separate from the required disaster drill every 6 months that the state is checking for, correct?
So the disaster drill is different than these requirements. That's a state drill, or that's a state requirement that we won't touch any of the other requirements you have. This is in addition to the requirements that you currently have. So all the training is different. All the testing will be different. You still have to do your fire drills. All those things all need to remain the same.
Let's see.
So somebody said they are signed up for a nursing home incident command training on September 12th. Will that count towards your training? And absolutely, that, as long as you contain documentation of that, that will count towards the training requirements. And for those folks that are still with us in Los Angeles County, on October 11th, in the city of Carson at the Doubletree Hilton, we'll be having a nursing home incident command all-day training that will be free. We'll do 5 hours of continuing education credits for those that need it. We'll provide lunch, and that will act as one of the training requirements. If you want to do that, we'll give you all the documentation you need to show proof to the surveyors, as well as we'll cover how Incident Command can help you meet some of these requirements and help you guys get prepared. And so if you haven't registered for that, we still have space available. My recommendation is to email Courtney or go to the website. Is there a link on the website to register for the next training?
Yeah, so if you go to the events page, it will go to CAHF.org's upcoming events, and you can register there for free, and you'll get 5 continuing education credits for participating. And we will also be doing a raffle.
Oh, yeah. So we've got, we talk about all this emergency preparedness for our facilities, but we all need to be personally prepared. And so we have a goodie bag that we'll raffle off with radios and water filtration devices and first aid kits and all kinds of stuff that you would need for like a grab-and-go bag for your family. So that being said, we've got a ton of other questions. We're going to try to answer them by emailing folks back. If you have specific questions about your facility, or whether something counts towards the exercise requirements, whether you had an event and you want to get our opinion, by all means, email myself or Courtney. We'll be happy to help you out. Sorry about the technical issues that affected us earlier. If you missed anything, we'll have it up on YouTube very soon. And you guys can do a recap there. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will have our next webinar next week. It will cover policies and procedures specific for skilled nursing facilities and intermediate care facilities. And until then, thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, welcome everybody to part 2 in the CMS Emergency Preparedness Rule webinar series.